Being one of the most ancient nation-states in Europe, Portugal is proud of its long music history, which accompanied and strongly contributed to the development of the outstanding music history in Europe. The music history of Portugal is reviewed here, from the earliest references in the end of the Roman Empire to the actuality. Medieval music, liturgical repertoire. In the early days of the Catholic Church, several local liturgies developed, such as the Gallican in France, the Psalm in England, the Antique Roman in Rome and the Ambrosian Rite in Milan. The Visigothic Council of Toledo organized the Hispanic Rite in 633. The main source of the Hispanic Rite is the Leon antiphonary, which was most probably copied from an original collected in Béjar. The Béjar region is home to one of the earliest mentions of a musician in the activity of Andre Princeps Cantorum. The oldest manuscript of Portuguese liturgical music in Toledan Hispanic notation is kept at the University of Coimbra General Library. Most other existing documents use Aquitaine notation. For the middle of the 13th century on, the notation presents typically Portuguese variations. This Portuguese notation was used until the 15th century, when modern notation in staves was adopted. However, the Church would start worrying soon about the proliferation of liturgies, for the mixture of the Gallican liturgy with the antique Roman one would result, traditionally under Pope Gregory I, the modern Roman liturgy, also known as Gregorian liturgy, comprising the Gregorian chant. This would become the official liturgy of the Catholic Church and substituted gradually the local ones. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Council of Burgos decreed the substitution of the Hispanic Rite by the modern Roman one in 1080. This measure was eased by the fact that, during the Reconquista, most part of the bishops were French. Profane music in Portugal, an aristocratic poetical musical genre, was cultivated, at least since the independence, whose texts are kept in three main collections: Cancioneiro Ajuda, Cancioneiro Biblioteca Nacional, Cancioneiro Vaticana. The 1680 poems kept in the Cancioneiros are divided in three forms: Cantigas de Amizade, Cantigas de Amor and Cantigas de Escânia e Maldizes. The intrinsic link to music is well expressed in the Cancioneiro Ajuda, where the staves have been drawn, but no melodies have been written. The only known musical source known until recently was due to a bookseller in Madrid, who found in the beginning of the 20th century a parchment with the 7 Cantigas de Amigo by Martin Codax, 6 of them with the respective melodies. Codax was a troubadour from the court of King Dinis I of Portugal. In 1990, Professor Harvey L. Shara discovered at the Torre Tombo in Lisbon a medieval document with 7 Cantigas de Amor by King Dom Dinis, including its musical setting. Development of polyphony. Little is known about the introduction of polyphony in Portugal. Polyphony was used in nearby places such as Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, and it was imported to Portugal in well-developed stage. Johann Simon de Haasprey was a well-known composer and defender of the ars subtilia, and helped popularize polyphony while in the court of Fernando I of Portugal. The main centers for Portuguese musical development during this period was the royal chapel, the monasteries, royal court, cathedrals and the university. The royal chapel, the Capella Real Royal Chapel, was founded by D. Dinis in 1299. D. Duarte elaborated a regiment of the chapel, which indicates that the standard practice was a 3-voice singing. His son, Afonso V, sent the Mestre de Capella, Alvaro Afonso, to the court of Henry VI of England in order to get a copy of the statutes, regiment and liturgy practiced in the English royal chapel. The detailed description written by William Say is still kept at Evora, the court. As with the trovadoresque poetry, we keep important collections of texts of the 15th and 16th century, but the musical documents are fewer. The main sources of the court music in the Renaissance and Mannerist periods are Cancioneiro de Elvas, Cancioneiro de Lisboa, Cancioneiro de Paris, Cancioneiro de Belém, the poetical forms of the villancette, the cantiga and the romance. The first two, similar to the French viola and the Italian ballata, are generally dedicated to the love thematic, though satire and social criticism are not excluded. They share a refrain and stanza structure. The romance is dedicated to celebrate historical events, applying the same musical text to all the stanzas of the poem. The cathedrals, Cardinal Princes de Afonso and de Henrique, sons of D. Manuel I of Portugal, administrated the main Portuguese dioceses through the 16th century. Afonso administrated the Evora and Lisboa dioceses until his death. Henrique was successively Archbishop of Braga, Lisboa and Evora, as well as head of the Portuguese Inquisition. He became King of Portugal when his grandnephew Sebastião died at Alcácer. As princes, they had the personal chapels and imposed a magnificent liturgy in the cathedrals they administrated. In Evora, D. Afonso attracted high-quality musicians for the cathedral by establishing significant wages. Pedro de Porto, cantor of the chapel of Isabel I of Castile, the Catholic queen, and master of the choir boys at Sevilla, comes as mestre de capella to Evora. He is the author of the most ancient polyphonic piece by a Portuguese author, as well as the most ancient polyphonic treatment of the Requiem in the Iberian Peninsula. D. Afonso also founded a school for the choir boys, allowing them to study after the voice change. Many of these boys became professional musicians. This Evora school formed high-standard musicians for more than 150 years. Besides Evora, Braga and Coimbra show a particular care in the liturgy. The most ancient version from a mass by a Portuguese author is from a cantor of the Coimbra Cathedral, Fernão Gomes Correia. The main monastery is the most important monastery, is kept a solemn liturgy. For these, the Santa Cruz Monastery in Coimbra had a particular importance. Founded in the 12th century by D. Afonso Henriques, it was the first school of superior studies in Portugal. In the 16th century, several monks distinguished by the musical gifts, as D. Heliodoro de Paiva and D. Francisco de Santa Maria. The musical performances at Santa Cruz competed with those at El Escorial, and were praised for the conciliation between polyphony and the respect for the sacred texts. The university. The Portuguese university was founded in Lisbon by D. Diniz in 1290 and had a music teacher as early as 1323. After several transfers between Coimbra and Lisbon, King João III established it definitively at Coimbra in 1537. The move to Coimbra was followed by a reorganization in 1544, in which the king himself proposed Mateus Araranda as music teacher. The music teacher was also mestre de capella of the university. The Mannerist period. Historical context. In the end of the 16th century, the circumstances lead to the disappearing of profane music in Portugal and a taking over by religious music. There are economical and political factors, like the troubles to keep the Portuguese conquests in Morocco and the competition led by Venetians and Turks to the spice trade, which leads to the closing of the Portuguese feitoria in Antwerp. In cultural terms, the influence of the Counter-Reformation in Portugal is enormous. João III introduces the Inquisition in Portugal. In 1536, his brother Henrique will be the first general inquisitor. The Jesuits come to Portugal in 1540 and soon start teaching in their own colleges in Coimbra and Lisbon. In 1555, they are in charge of the Arts College in Coimbra, after the expulsion by the Inquisition of its most reputed teachers. The Portuguese Church participated actively in the Council of Trent, and in 1564, Portugal becomes the only Catholic country where the council decisions are integrally published as laws. In this context, the profane music declined in the courts of João III and his grandson Sebastião I. In 1578, with the death of Sebastião I, Cardinal Henrique becomes King of Portugal. After his death in 1580, Portugal loses its independence, as the throne is inherited by Felipe II, King of Spain. With the disappearance of the court in Lisbon, the aristocracy retired to the homes in the countryside, and the profane music nearly vanishes. The development of the Portuguese music in the end of 16th is thus mainly in the sacred polyphony. Climax of the Evora school. In 1575, Cardinal Henrique brought Manuel Mendes, Mestre de Capella at Portalegre, to Evora, where he took the Mestre de Claustre position. Besides his qualities as a composer, Manuel Mendes is remarkable as a teacher. He formed the most part of the extremely competent professional musicians who would have the most reputed musical positions in Portugal in the next decades. Between his students at Evora, we have the most noted polyphonists of the next generation: Fr. Manuel Cardoso, Felipe de Magalhães and Huarte Lobo. These continued the pedagogical action of their teacher, worthing him references as Mestre de toda boa música deste reino, and El Mendes Sonoroso que de Músicos Lena toda a Europa. Other centers of musical activity in the 17th century: Santa Cruz at Coimbra. The main composers in the 17th century are D. Pedro de Cristo, D. Pedro da Esperança and D. Gabriel de S. João. The manuscripts kept at the General Library of the University of Coimbra reveal innovative polyphonic practices, such as polychorality, accompanied monody and instrument obbligato. The Royal Chapel. In spite of the absence of the king, it remains an important center, with mestres de capella such as Francisco Garro, Felipe de Magalhães and Marcos Soares Pereira. Chapel of the Dukes of Bragança at Vila Viçosa. During the Spanish domination, the Duke of Bragança retired to his palace in Vila Viçosa. The ducal chapel maintained a magnificent liturgy, and, in 1609, Teodosio II founded the Santos Reis Magos College, working in a similar way to the Evora school. Roberto Torna, Mestre de Capella at Vila Viçosa, would become the musical instructor of the young Duke of Barcelos de João. This king, both before and after succeeding to the Portuguese throne, enlarged immensely the musical library of his father, transforming it in the biggest musical library of the time in Europe. Further, João IV was a composer and a theorist himself, as well as a devoted patron of João Lourenço Rebelo, whose works he would send for printing at Rome. Rebelo, some of whose pieces have been issued on CD, composed in an innovative style, making use of opulent polychoral writing à la Giovanni Gabrieli and combining it with the more conservative idiom of Palestrina. Instrumental music. It was in the domain of organ music, the organ being itself the liturgical instrument par excellence, that Portugal's composers of the 16th and 17th centuries achieved particularly high standards. Portuguese organs, as well as Spanish ones, usually had just one manual, without pedalboard. Nevertheless, the surviving music conceived for these organs does often show considerable contrapuntal ingenuity as far as the writing for keyboard is concerned. Several organ mechanisms were cultivated more in the Iberian Peninsula than anywhere else. For example, these organs frequently incorporated a device known as Mayer register, which, when activated, divided the keyboard into two distinct parts with sharp contrasts in timbre, giving the effect of two manuals instead of one. Another conspicuous feature in both Portugal and Spain was the horizontal placing of particularly powerful, strident reed stops, very useful for imitating trumpet fanfares. In the 16th century, Antonio Carreira was the chief Portuguese organist-composer, but Carreira's output was never published during his lifetime. The first printed volume of Portuguese instrumental music did not appear until 1620, Floras de Música para o Instrumento de Tecla e Harpa, by Manuel Rodrigues Coelho, who died in around 1635. This contains only sacred compositions. Coelho worked as an organist in the cathedrals of Badajoz, Elvas and Lisbon. During the 17th century, a notable school of organists developed in Braga. The main figures in this connection were Gaspar dos Reis, employed at Braga Cathedral, Pedro de Araujo, and a priest-composer, Diogo da Conceição. Two prominent genres of early Portuguese organ music were the tento de meia register and the batalha. This last form goes back to one of the most famous pieces by Clement Genequin, La Batalha Marinha Nálaga, in which the characteristic sounds of a battle are imitated. The Iberian composers would often quote whole phrases from Genequin's original, adding to these phrases distinctive keyboard figuration. The Baroque period and the Italian influence. João the Magnificent. Around the end of the 17th century, Portuguese composers gradually evolved towards the new musical language that would result in the modern tonalism. The government of João marks a profound transition in the Portuguese society and culture. After the definitive peace with Spain, the monarch will try to modernize the Portuguese economy and to drive the country to a development scheme similar to the French absolutism of Louis XIV. The main originality on João's absolutism is that he managed, using his influence with the Pope, to face the huge political, economical and cultural power of the Church, by reorganizing it in order to strengthen its unity and discipline, and then putting it under the royal authority. In a very clever process, João got for his chapel the dignity of patriarchal basilica, by dividing the Lisbon archdioceses. The chaplain became a cardinal. Then he got the reunification of the dioceses under the command of the royal chaplain. So, the Cardinal Patriarch, Archbishop of Lisbon, was merely the chaplain of the King of Portugal. João took a special care with the liturgy in his chapel, which he wanted as monumental as the papal chapel in Rome. He got it repeating somehow the formula of Cardinal D'Afonso 200 years before, contracting high-standard professional musicians and creating structures for the adequate formation of Portuguese musicians. As such, he contracted the brilliant master of the Capella Julia in Rome, Domenico Scarlatti, as Mestre da Capella Real and music teacher of Princess D. Maria Magdalena Barbara, and founded in 1713 a specialized school annexed to the Patriarchal Basilica, the Patriarchal Seminary, which would become the major music school in Portugal and form generations of professional musicians of remarkable quality until the foundation of the National Conservatory in 1835. The most gifted students of the Patriarchal Seminary were sent to Rome at the king's expenses. Those were the cases, namely, of Antonio Teixeira, João Rodrigues Esteves and Francisco Antonio de Almeida, who were hence formed in the Roman ecclesiastic Baroque school and had the chance of getting acquainted with the Roman operatic tradition. Opera and its beginnings. The first performance of Il Don Ciccio della Mancia, with music by Scarlatti, took place in 1728 in the Ribeira Palace at Lisbon. This was the first operatic-style performance in Portugal and was followed by other opera buffa performances in the Royal Palace in the years to come. However, they had little impact in the music life, not only because the public had extremely limited access, but also because the king did not pay much attention to them. It was in the Trindade Theatre in 1735 that the Alessandro Paghetti Company had permission to perform the first opera seria for a wider audience. The success was enormous and the company kept performing until 1742, now in the Rua dos Condes Theatre. At the same time, a set of performances in Portuguese by Antonio José da Silva's plays had begun in the Bairro Alto Theatre, with music by Antonio Teixeira. The audience of these plays grew even wider. However, D. João V became ill in 1742, and the mysticism that surrounded him in his last years resulted in a prohibition against all theatrical performances until his death. Instrumental music. Undoubtedly, the most important Portuguese keyboard composer of the time is José Antonio Carlos Sicas, son of Francisco Vaz, organist of the Coimbra Cathedral. Carlos Sicas goes, with only 16 years of age, but already very famous, to Lisbon, where he is appointed as organist of the Patriarchal Cathedral. There, he would soon be appointed as Vice Mestre de Capella. Sicas has left us 105 two-part Baroque sonatas for keyboard. He also wrote religious and orchestral music. However, his most original contribution is a concert for harpsichord and strings, one of the first examples of this form in Europe. Opera and sacred music under D. José I and D. Maria I. With D. José I, the operatic activity is taken again. The Neapolitan David Perez, one of the most reputed Italian opera composers, is hired in 1752. The climax of Perez's activity would be the inauguration of the monumental Opera de Tejo in March 1755, with the opera Alessandro Nelandi. But the Lisbon earthquake of the 1st of November 1755 destroyed the new building, together with Lisbon downtown. The Royal Palace also disappeared, and with it the musical library of D. João IV. After the earthquake, the public theatres like the Rua dos Condes Theatre and the Bairro Alto Theatre were rebuilt. Already under D. Maria I would be built the S. Carlos Theatre in Lisbon and the S. João Theatre in Oporto. The Neapolitan influence is enormous, and, under D. José and D. Maria, the gifted music students of the Patriarchal are sent to Santo Honor Conservatory in Naples. Afterwards, these students distinguished in the Neapolitan operatic style, as well as in the sacred music. Between these we have João de Sousa Carvalho, Avila Vicosa school student and perhaps the most prominent composer of the second half of the 18th century. Besides his operatic and sacred music production, he may also be considered the most remarkable keyboard composer of the time. Other relevant Portuguese composers of the time are Jerónimo Francisco de Lima, Luciano Xavier dos Santos, José Joaquim dos Santos, José dos Santos Mauricio, Antonio Leal Moreira, and particularly Marcos Portugal, perhaps the Portuguese composer with the most international career ever. The 19th century. With the Napoleonic invasions, the royal family goes to Brazil and the court establishes in the Rio de Janeiro. This presence would conduce to the independence of this colony and would be beneficial as well to the development of Brazilian music. Meanwhile, the constitutional regime is proclaimed and King D. João V is forced to come back. The activity of the Royal Chamber Orchestra, which had been in the previous century one of the most important chambers chamber orchestras in Europe, declines irreversibly. However, in the turn of the 19th century, generalizes the tradition of amateur academies performing the contemporary instrumental music. The generalization of public concerts is due to João Domingo's bom tempo, the most prominent musical figure of the first half of the 19th century. Bom tempo, son of an Italian musician of the court orchestra, studied with the patriarchal masters. Unlike most of his contemporaries, he was not interested in opera and, in 1801, instead of going to Italy, he travels to Paris, starting a virtuoso pianist career. He moves to London in 1810 and gets acquainted with the liberal circles. In 1822, he is back to Lisbon and founds a Philharmonic Society to promote public concerts of the contemporary music. After the civil war between liberals and absolutists, bom tempo becomes music teacher of Queen D. Maria II and first director of the National Conservatory, created in 1835, and which replaced the old patriarchal seminary, extinct by the liberal regime. As a composer, bom tempo produced a vast amount of concerti, sonatas, variations and fantasias for the piano. His two known symphonies are the first to be produced by a Portuguese composer. The masterpiece of bom tempo is his Requiem to the memory of Luís de Camões,